And now I'm going to start the webinar, and I'll do the intro, and we'll do the montage, and then after that, you can start your conversation. So have a great event.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Katie.
Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Nandana Dev Sen presenting her translation of the poetry collection Acrobat by her mother, the beloved Bengali writer Nabaneeta Dev Sen. She'll be talking with Megha Majumdar, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Nandana, Megha, and the team at Archipelago Books for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees on the top of your Zoom screen. So the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. If you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Acrobat, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week, and you can purchase Nabaneeta's book and many others on site, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat in just a moment. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Megha Majumdar. She is the author of the novel A Burning, which was a New York Times bestseller and notable book, and was nominated for the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, and the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal. She was born and raised in Kolkata, India, and now lives in New York City, where she works as an editor at Catapult. A Burning is her first book. She will be speaking with our featured author and translator, Nandana Dev Sen. She is a writer, actor, and child rights activist. She has written 6 children's books, translated into more than 15 languages globally, and starred in 20 feature films from 4 continents in numerous languages. She has represented UNICEF, Grahi, and the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights to fight against child abuse and to end human trafficking. Winner of the Last Girl Champion Award and multiple Best Actress Awards, Nandana is Child Protection Ambassador for Save the Children India. Tonight, Nandana presents her translation of the poetry collection Acrobat by her mother, the beloved Bengali writer Nabaneeta Dev Sen. Acrobat is a radiant collection of poetry about womanhood, intimacy, and the body politic that together evokes the arc of an ordinary life. This collection has been praised by the likes of Gloria Steinem, Siddhartha Mukherjee, Tobias Carroll, and Amitav Ghosh, who says, "These translations of Nabaneeta Dev Sen's poems capture her quirky yet profound voice so beautifully that I felt I could hear her reading them out loud. These are the poems of an adventurous and indefatigable traveler, observing the world with deep understanding and sympathy through the prism of a sensibility that is securely rooted in the culture of Bengal." Before we get started, we have a montage of Nabaneeta Dev Sen that we're going to play for you all. After that, Nandana will be talking with Megha and with all of you. Here we go. Here is the montage. Are you seeing the montage?
Yeah.
Yeah, good, great.
That was beautiful. So many beautiful photos. Thank you everybody for coming. Nabaneeta Dev Sen was, of course, a beloved icon of Bengali literature and Indian literature. It's such an honor to be here with Nandana Dev Sen today. Nandana, would you like to introduce this book that we are celebrating today, Acrobat, in your own words?
Yes, I would love to. But first, I want to thank you for making the time to do this in the middle of all the adventures that you're going through now, professional and personal. So many congratulations. And we are so proud of you. I am so proud of you as a friend and as a Bengali for the glorious praise, for all the love that your breathtaking book, The Burning, has got. And I know how insanely busy you are right now. So thank you for making the time to do this. I also want to give a big thank you to the wonderful team at Archipelago and also in Greenlight Books for organizing this. We were just discussing earlier that I had the pleasure of doing a couple of book events in Greenlight before, but it's been 2 years since I had a chance to do that, and it's so wonderful to be back in Greenlight, even though this is virtual. I know this is going to be a lot of fun. And to all of you who have made the time to join us today from around the world, there's some friends who are coming, who've joined us from England, some extremely and unwisely loyal friends from Kolkata. So thank you all for being with us today, and Eid Mubarak. I'm so excited to be doing this with you, Megha. Thank you. You were asking me about this book that we are talking about now. As you know, this is a selection of my mother's poetry written over 60 years. So it has poems from her very first book of poems that was published when she was not even 21. It's a book called Prothom Protoy. It also has poems that she wrote at the end of her life, which hadn't been published earlier. You know, Ma had this little Kobitar Khata, little notebook that she kept under her pillow until the end, and she would jot lines down, thoughts and poems, lines of poetry whenever they came to her. This book was she was very excited about it because we signed this just 2 weeks before she left us. And although Ma had over 100 books to her credit, this was unbelievably going to be the first book that was published for a world audience. So she was really thrilled about it, which was very sweet for me to see, because this was a poet who had very consciously chosen not to write in English. She had made a political decision to write in Bangla to preserve the language and literature of Bengal. So, but there was one thing, there was a part of her that was always sad that her work had not reached a larger audience internationally. So this was, she was very excited about. After Ma passed away, the pandemic hit us. So I ended up working on this book, which was going to be our joint project on my own. So it felt like it kind of became a conversation between Ma and me. It's a conversation that I wasn't ready to end. So I guess, to go back to your question, how would I describe it in my own words? I would say that this is a book of my mother's poetry and a conversation with my mother.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And as you said, you know, the poems here span a long and celebrated career. How did this project of curating and translating begin? What did it look like for you?
Yes, so, you know, the translating started a long time ago, 30 years ago, when I was in college. And it happened entirely by accident. Ma was also, of course, a distinguished scholar. So she was on a lecture tour, speaking she was going to a few comparative literature conferences in Canada and in the States, and she came to visit me in my freshman dormitory, and she was invited by the Bunting Institute at Radcliffe to read a few of her poems, which she was very excited to do, but she didn't have her poetry in English with her. She had actually already written quite a bit of poetry in English, and some of her Bengali poetry had been translated, but none of it was with her at the time. So we got to work and started translating the poems that she loved the most. And that's how many of those poems are actually in Acrobat. That's how the translation, kind of, it became, it's something that we ended up doing quite a bit of throughout the years, but that was the beginning of that tradition, so to speak. But it was always born out of necessity. Another time when I started translating was when we were in China, in Beijing. There's a lovely bookstore called Bookworm, and they wanted us to have a conversation. And my mother had just had a new book of poetry out, that one, Tumi Monosthir Koro. And she wanted to include some of those poems in the reading, and there weren't any translated yet. So I did some translations, which eventually became a book called Make Up Your Mind, which I did as a birthday surprise for her, which fell into the brilliant, visionary hands and gaze of Jill Schoolman, who's the amazing publisher of Acrobat. And she then said that this is a project that we should do together. And I was so excited. My mother was thrilled to hear this. And Jill actually moved heaven and earth to make sure that my mother saw the cover of the book, even though the book wasn't written yet. Oh. So that was also another very sweet part of the genesis of the book, was going through the images, choosing that image by Rabindranath Tagore for the book with her. So that was the translation part of it. And then the curation, that is what I did in the last year. Some of the poems my mother had selected herself, but not very many. Those, of course, are in the book, but also I kind of tried to choose poems that were representative both of times in her life and also ways in which her writing changed, so that they represented her as a poet with her evolving voice throughout her long career of writing poetry. There are also some some poems that she wrote in English that I included, which are beautiful, and some poems that she translated herself, some that we did together, one that my sister translated. So all of those went into the curation of it.
Yeah, and I love the range of poems in this book. You know, the themes of love, parenthood. There are mysteries in these poems, which I keep coming back to. There is so much here, and maybe this is a good way to kind of segue into what you and I planned, Nandana, which is that we would give everybody watching a taste of the book by reading a few poems and then talking about them. So maybe the first one that we can read is, that you can read, is Combustion.
Wonderful. Combustion. As powerful as that volcano range is this range of alphabets. Touch it, and you'll burn to ashes instantly.
I love that poem because it is so beautifully about the power of words. You know, it's about the power of telling our stories. And you quote your mother in the introduction for this book saying, "I speak for poetry as being central to a woman's freedom." I was really struck by that. Can you speak about what that faith in language, that conviction brings to mind for you?
Yes, I would love to. You know, there are a few different questions hidden in that wonderful question of yours. So the faith in language, the faith in the word, the faith in poetry is in our family a kind of intergenerational faith. We are an obsessively secular family always, but the one goddess uh, we have always worshipped without fail is Saraswati, whom you see over there, the goddess of books and art and learning and wisdom. And we never worshipped her in a kind of with a priest and with all of those, but we worshipped her in our own way through poetry and songs. And because my mother was born into a family full, both um, very celebrated poets. It was a house full of poetry that we grew up in. My grandmother was a child widow who remarried a poet and reinvented herself as a poet, actually as two poets, because she wrote in she had two poetic personas, and she had a pseudonym. She wrote as Radharani Devi and Aparajita Devi. The reason why I'm going into this is because my mother saw as a child the transformative power of poetry. She really saw how uh, how my grandmother's life had been completely changed and deeply empowered by writing, by poetry. And this faith in language it's something that we inherited within the family. And it's also I'll come back to the question about freedom, because that's very important to my mother's work, and it's key as well. But within the family, since we're talking about the family faith, you know, in our family, we would celebrate everything with poetry. So if there was a birthday or an academic prize or an anniversary, it wouldn't be a card. We would write poems to each other. That's the way we did it. When I was
beautiful.
And so it was, we didn't really, we always expressed ourselves and not in a, it just seemed like the natural thing to do. So when I was a very sad, and not a very sad, but just I was missing home a lot when I came to college, like you, and same college. And my mother, and at that time it wasn't so easy to make phone calls and things. We did have one weekly phone call, but my mother, whenever she sensed my sadness, she would, in these blue aerograms, send me poems which were either really funny and cute and made me laugh. They were like really funny choras, or they were very beautiful and calming and comforting, and they were poems that I would keep going back to, and not necessarily long ones. But so there was a family tradition of working our way through our feelings through poetry, if that makes sense. So there was that. Now, what my mother meant when she said that poetry is central to a woman's freedom, of course, she believed this. This is something that she had learned in the way she was brought up, but she also felt very strongly that poetry was a vital necessity for all women, and she wasn't only talking about women in the cities writing who had done multiple degrees in literature and were writing poetry. But she was also talking about oral work songs, about Ram Kathas and Sita Kathas, and felt that by taking control of language, the process of taking control of language could set women free and could also unite them. It was a way of coming together. It built solidarity, and it brought a kind of liberty. So because she felt so strong, she believed so strongly in the power, in the importance of poetry in women's lives, she actually also spent a lot of time translating women's poetry from across the world. Although she did not like translating her own poems, but she was very committed. She was very committed to that as a project. And then the last thing I would say, since this is the poem that we chose, it does talk about the power of poetry, but it also talks about the destructive potential of poetry, of language, right? So my mother had from that point of view, she had a very fraught relationship, in fact, with poetry, where she felt that she was blessed by poetry, but she also felt she was cursed by poetry. She was acutely aware of the violence that can lurk in language. So she felt that it was a momentous responsibility to be a writer and to be a poet. So every word that she chose was chosen after with great care. And that's part of what that poem is about. But there's so many other poems. She actually wrote about that quite a lot in her poetry.
That's so wise. And I love the thought of the aerograms that you talked about. I'm still thinking about those. I hope you have those saved somewhere.
I have some of them. I wish I had more. I've now moved so many times.
Yeah.
They're all somewhere because they would not, but where is it? Is the
right.
Is it? And which they're all lovingly put away somewhere. But
yeah.
So yes.
So the next poem that I thought we could talk about is Return of the Dead, if you would like to read that.
I would love to. That's a wonderful poem for you to choose because it's about the city that both of us are from and that my mother was from. Return of the Dead. Receive me then, Kolkata. I am your true love, your whole world. I'm back from the war, an aborted mother. I have brought the ocean with me instead. My lap is empty, yes, but my breasts are heavy, overflowing with wasted milk. Look at the fathomless salt water in my eyes. Come then, look at me. See how virginity burns on my brow again, fiery as the setting sun. Touch me, for my newborn flesh belongs to you now. Receive me then, Kolkata, in your waiting arms. Your loneliness is over at last. I have returned just as you had wanted me to. Why this stunned silence then? This anxious glance, this daze? Lift your face. Don't shift your eyes. Look at me. Your prayers were heard. Here I am, returned from the dead. Yes, it's me. Your childhood sweetheart, your world of passion, your old flame, your very own Nabaneeta.
It's a beautiful poem. And like you said, it is, it is about Kolkata. And Nabaneeta Dev Sen spent long periods of time away from Kolkata. She lived and worked abroad. Can I ask you about her relationship to Kolkata and her reflections on migrations and her time abroad?
Yes, so she loved Kolkata, and she always saw Kolkata as her hometown, as her home, not just her hometown, but as her home, no matter where she lived. When she left Kolkata, she left as quite a glamorous figure in the world of art and literature and culture in India. She already had a book out, her first book of poetry, Pratham Pratay, was out. She was also a very really talented artist, visual artist. So she had a couple of exhibitions. She was a brilliant student. She was going off to Harvard to study. So she was quite a dazzling personality who also was engaged to another dazzling personality. So when she came back, and then a lot happened in between. She continued her work. She was a brilliant student at Harvard, at Berkeley, at Newnham College. She had us. She got very busy as a scholar and as a mother. She always continued to write poetry, but she didn't write another book for many years until she came back. And she came back when her marriage fell apart. She came back with us. So the return, she had sort of left as this starlet of a certain kind, and she came back in the shadow of a scandal and found that her, and no one in her literary and social circle had encountered a divorcee before. Divorce was not something that happened at all at that time. So no one quite knew how to respond to her. So there was an awkwardness that she felt, a kind of discomfort in everyone's eyes, and and this was sort of a turning point. I mean, the return was a turning point in a way, because she was leaving behind a life, the life she had lived as the only adult life she had lived, and she also started working as a professor at Jadavpur University. She came back to live with my grandmother. That's when we started living in this all-female family, which was an amazing experience. And she went back to her poetry and started writing poetry all the time once she was back. And that was, she was, I think it, and she made her, she was so prolific, and she was also so brilliant that initial discomfort was dissipated soon, because she made a place for herself through her audience, through her students. She was always a very enthusiastic and generous mentor as well. So I don't think it took her long to find her place again, but I think that poem is written at that moment of transition.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to
say sorry, because you did ask a very interesting question about migration and her relation to that as a writer. So when she came back to India, she decided that she would stop writing in English. When she lived in England, she wrote a lot of poetry in English. Of course, all her academic work was in English and continued to be in English. But her creative work had also been in English previously, because she was living in an English-speaking world. When she came back, she decided that she did not want to do that. And, around the same, a few years after this, she wrote a wonderful novel called Probashido Vervashe. The protagonist of the novel is this young poet called Bipasha, and it's the story in reverse, who emigrates to England and stops writing in Bengali. So in my mother's case, she chose to do exactly the reverse. She came back from England to India and stopped writing in English.
That is such an interesting choice, and I hope we will have time later in this hour to talk about that. But I did want to ask you about your work as a translator. And I wonder if I could ask you to read a poem called The Great Fair.
Oh, I love that poem. Yes. Where is that? The Great Fair. You would take me to the great fair you had promised. I'd buy a bamboo flute splashed with colors, a small chariot, 2 clay horses, little pots and pans, toys, a mask, a golden-haired, glass-eyed doll. Making a list long enough to buy up the whole fair, filling my little cup with all the coins I'd saved, I waited for you on my steps. You were going to come back and take me with you to the great fair. As I waited on my steps, my limbs grew long, my list blew away in the wind, my cup of change became a trunk of gold. There is nothing left for me to buy from your great fair anymore. I am going to get up from my steps now.
This poem makes me think about many poems by Tagore, and I keep coming back to its mystery, its unwillingness to give up all of its secrets, its encouragement to look closer. So how do you, as the translator, work with this balance of mystery and invitation?
It's a really lovely question. You know, it's so true that there are many resonances between this particular poem and some other poems of my mother's, and a lot of Rabindranath Thakur's poetry, as well as his songs. And I think what creates the mystery and the invitation is this this childlike joy that was always inherent to their poetic sensibilities, even when the poems were sad poems. There was such an innocence about that, and I think it's a lovely comparison that and it's very well observed to make that connection. And I think with my mother, she had that. There was an innocence that was a part of her personality at all times. There was a kind of rambunctiousness. There was a real kind of wholehearted embracing of every experience. There was a great deal of curiosity. There was a huge appetite for celebrating everything, for festivals, for fairs, for moments when we can really rejoice, right? So she was that person. And at the same time, she was often surprised, and this is a poem in which you feel that there was a part of her that innocent core in her that almost that seemed to be surprised by the world having suddenly grown up on her. You know, how did that happen? She was not prepared for it. And you see that also in a lot of the poems that she wrote about motherhood. It's a similar thing where she was navigating the need to be adult, to be an adult woman, with that essence in her that was always going to be a child. And I think with this one, you know, the other thing that what you do, I don't know if this answers your question, is the way to keeping the mystery and the invitation is to actually focus on the vulnerability and the love, the need to be loved, the need to love and the need to be loved, which is so clear in this poem, isn't it? And that is the way to the heart of the poem, I think.
I love what you say about vulnerability. That feels exactly right in this poem, because I feel like it's one of those poems that I have been, you know, this book has been by my bedside and I've been reading it and kind of coming back to the poems. And this is one of the poems where I kept coming back to it and thinking, you know, what is it? What is it at the center of this poem? So I think you just allowed me a new way into this poem. For everybody watching, I want to remind you that you can get a copy of Acrobat from Greenlight. Please do it if you don't have a copy already. It's a beautiful book. It is so rich, and there is so much to come back to within this book. And I'll also remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A box, which is just at the bottom of the screen. We will take questions from you very soon. Meantime, I have another question for you, which I think goes further along those lines. And so in the introduction, there's this line which really struck me, because you have written that I am not a poet. And I really want to dig into that a little bit with the help of a poem called Alphabet Bird, where you've added a few lines in addition to translating it. So could I ask you to read Alphabet Bird?
Alphabet bird. When night falls, I search for him, I bring him home, I look him in the eye, and I cage language. When day breaks, once again the world wraps around my eyes, and off he flies, taking each word, that alphabet bird. So this is, okay, so as I mentioned earlier that I had done a book of poems as a birthday surprise for my mother when she turned 75. And these were translations from her book, Tumi Monosthir Koro. And this was one of the poems in that. Because I was doing it as a secret, kind of as a birthday surprise, I was doing it on the sly, I couldn't actually talk to her about the choices I was making as a translator. I don't see you anymore, Megha. Are you still there?
It looks like she fell off for a second, so we're trying to get her back on. But
Okay.
you can continue talking about it, and we'll work on getting her back. I think she might have had an internet issue.
Okay. So I didn't tell Ma about the fact that I was translating these poems for her. And I did a translation. There you are. We missed you.
This has to happen once every event. It is the rule of virtual events now. But I think it cut out just as I was asking you to read Alphabet Bird, Nandana.
I did read Alphabet Bird.
So in that case, I can jump into the question that I had about it.
I just want to make sure that everybody heard it, though. Did I get cut off also? Maybe we can ask Katie.
No, you were totally fine. It was just Megha dropped off for a moment.
Okay. You were sorely missed, Megha.
I'm back now. So for Alphabet Bird, I was going to ask you if you could talk about that hybrid of translating and building on a poem.
Yeah, so this poem I was just beginning to talk about it, and then I realized you weren't here. But so I translated it on the sly for my mother because it went into this book, which was a birthday surprise for her 75th birthday, which meant that I couldn't actually talk to her about the choices I was making as a translator. I did the translation quite sort of with great faithfulness, and I felt, to the point that you were making earlier, that somehow the translation was not imparting the mystery that's in the poem, the elusiveness of language, the uncontrollability of language, the impossibility of imprisoning language, right? That this poem is about. That didn't quite come through in the translation, even though every word in Bangla was translated into English. So I then decided to look at it a slightly different way and think of how, not literally translating it, but think about what the poem was about and how my mother would have written that in English if it were to be an English poem. And I decided that in that case, she would have probably extended on some of those thoughts. And I added a few lines like I cage language, and also the line taking each word, that alphabet bird. In so doing, she had a lovely light rhyming scheme in the Bengali poem, which was shorter. Now this was a longer poem. So I also added an element to the rhyming scheme so that it would would be more whole as a poem and be still true to what the rhyme was doing in the original. So those were and then when I showed it to her, when it was no longer a surprise, I asked her, because we'd done print run of 75 books for her 75th birthday for her to give to 75 friends. And then we decided, because a lot of people wanted the book, so we decided to do a proper print run, and then it actually got reprinted a few times. So I asked Ma, I can put this other translation instead, because that's a more literal translation. And she said, no, this is the way I want it. This is what I wanted to say. So something about the helplessness that you feel in the poem, the loss of control, I couldn't find that in my own translation. And I felt like I needed to expand on that a little bit.
That's so funny that you added the line, I cage language. It's one of my favorite kind of notes that the poem hits. So that's really beautiful.
Thank you for saying that. Funnily enough, my mother also said that was the line that was not there, had now become her favorite line in the whole poem.
Next, I wonder if I can ask you about a pair of poems. One of them is A House the Color of Pain, and the other is Out of Reach.
Love both of those. A House the Color of Pain. The house has become the color of pain. I can't return to that house again. Turn the boat around, wind of my heart, blow to a different land, to another part. Shall I read the other one now, or should we?
Yes, please. I think the question probably could get both of them.
Okay, so with the other one, what I'd like to do is, because that has I love that poem, I'm glad you asked me to read it. It also has a very particular rhyming scheme. It's also quite musical as a poem. So is it okay if I read the Bengali? It's a short poem. I'd love to share the Bengali.
Yes, please. I'm very excited to hear it.
Thank you. ভালোবাসা 12 তুমি চেয়েছিলে নিরুপাধি প্রেম অনধিগম্য আমি গেথে আনি লবঙ্গলতা তোমারই জন্য তুমি বুঝি চাও প্রেমের বাতাস নাতিশীতোষ্ণ আমি বইয়ে দিই কাল বৈশাখী ভয়াল কৃষ্ণ তোমার প্রণয় প্রযুক্ত নয় দূর বিশুদ্ধ আমার প্রণয় কিছুটা যুদ্ধ Out of reach. You asked for a nameless love, out of reach. I weaved you a wreath of blooms, each to each. You want love's tempered breeze, softly sighing. I blow you a thunderstorm, terrifying. Your love is detached, afar, chaste to its core. My love is in part love and in part war.
That was beautiful. I loved hearing it in Bangla. And my question was going to be about how do you preserve the rhymes even in translation? That feels like an incredibly complex task.
It is. It is difficult. I mean, translating any poetry is difficult with or without rhyme. Translating poetry in rhyme is hard. It's especially hard if the poet is absolutely brilliant in rhyming. So my mother, and this is something she had inherited from both her parents. Actually, my grandfather was a translator as well, and he was extremely interested in poetic form and structure. So she and my grandmother too was very meticulous about form. So every poem of hers scanned perfectly. There was never a syllable too many. And my grandfather was that way as well. He did it. He translated the Rubaiyat, he translated sonnets, and he did everything with kind of impeccable fidelity and whenever possible, or appropriateness. But so she loved using rhymes, and she used them in a number of different ways. She used them to emphasize emotions. She used them to create surprises, revelations. She used them to sometimes express dissent. Also, she used them in a contrary way. So she was not just someone who loved rhyming. Her rhyming was so central to the meaning of each poem. So I decided when I did Acrobat that I would translate any poem that was translated, any poem that was written in rhyme, I would translate in rhyme, which is not a decision I had made when I did Make Up Your Mind. There were a few poems there in which the originals were in rhyme and the translations were not. So I actually went back to them and redid them for Acrobat. I didn't want any. So one of the poems that we had discussed earlier, for instance, called Change, was one of those that is different. There's another poem that I also like very much called Face to Face, which was, her original was in rhyme. My first translation was not. And then I went back to it and did another version, keeping the rhyme, which ended up being quite different. Like, it feels like a different poem, but I'm happy I did that. It feels closer to the original. So yes, that was, but I actually love rhymes too. It's something that I think, because we are this absurdly poetry loving family, I think we, it was a challenge, but it was a beautiful one. It was lovely to have to be ambitious. And to know that you had, that there was a very high standard that you had to kind of match, right?
Yes, what a challenge. So I have been asking you to read all of these poems which stay with me and which really made such an impression on me, but I want to give you a chance to talk about, if there's a favorite poem of yours that we haven't touched on yet, if you want to bring it into the conversation.
I would love to, but first I would actually very much like you to read one of your favorite poems. And I, whichever one you would like, I would really love to hear you read one of your favorites. I've read so many now.
Okay, I'll do it. I think I emailed you about one which just, I want to have it framed on my wall. And here it's called Unspoken.
What's that one?
And when I read it, let me read it and then I'll talk about it. But okay, so this is Unspoken. Each time you say forever, forever, I only hear today, today. I feel like every person who is making something and trying to use their time meaningfully on this earth will probably have feelings about this poem, because it's such a reminder that, eternity is just lived in pieces of days and hours, and just a reminder to step back into our lives when we feel like we are moving away from it, or being, getting caught up in things that are trivial. Anyway, I think it's such a beautifully profound poem.
And it's a beautiful interpretation of it too. I'm so glad that you chose that poem and you read that. It's such a, it is absolutely one of my favorites as well. And every time I read it, I find a different way of looking at it. I very much see it as the way you see it. I think, to me, that is the way, that is what the poem is about, the urgency and the value of time, and also of being in the moment, the importance of not not stepping out of the moment, right?
Mhm.
But it's also like when I think of it in relation to the poem that I read before this, which is Out of Reach, which is a kind of conversation, right? It's almost like a call and response. It's almost like this is what
Mm.
you want, this is what I give you. That's what you that's your app, this is mine, right? And this poem, if I think of it in that kind of a context, it also feels like it could be a conversation between two lovers. The Out of Reach clearly is about two lovers, right?
Mhm.
This is a conversation about one lover, about two lovers having two very different perspectives about, or maybe different versions. Maybe there is forever is not meant entirely truthfully, and the other
Oh.
the other one is saying, you may be saying forever, but I hear you. I hear you. I hear you
Oh.
say today.
It's a completely new way of reading the poem. Yeah.
But it may not be. It's also maybe, and this is the way that I tend to think. I feel it's a conversation with yourself, and there's a part of you that says forever, and there's another part of you that says grab it right now, today,
Yeah.
it's now. So I don't know, but that's the beauty of this time. It's probably your shortest poem in the whole book, but you can spend hours talking about it and thinking about
There are
it.
probably a dozen or more ways to read it. Yeah.
Yes.
Um,
Thank you for
did you-
reading it, choosing it, and for reading it so beautifully.
Of course, my pleasure. It's such an honor. I hope I did it. Some measure of justice.
You did.
Did you want to bring another favorite poem of yours into the conversation? I know we're also getting close to the hour mark, and I'll say that we do have a few minutes for questions if something has
Go
popped.
to questions, and if there's, because I want to make sure that we answer all the questions, and if there's time after that, I'll read a favorite poem.
That
You've
sounds
read so
good.
many of my favorites already. And I do have a favorite poem that I'd love to read, called Catch of the Day, but maybe should we read it later or no? What do you think?
Sure. Okay. We have so many questions. We prepared so many questions. Here's a question that I really want to ask you. Can I ask you to read Story of a Dry Leaf?
Oh, yes. Yes. The Story of a Dry Leaf. The other day on the road, you had brushed away a bit of dry leaf from my hair. Now I am buried in a heap of dry leaves, invisible. Where did you go?
I love this poem. There is such tenderness in it. There's such romance. There is melancholy. And I really would love to ask you, did the process of translating this poem and really this whole book, did it make you see your mother's work differently in any way?
Yes, very much so. And for a number of reasons. One was that I grew up with the poetry. I knew it. I loved it. I took it for granted, like you take your family for granted, right? You adore it, but it's just there. You assume that it's just a part of your life and your emotional landscape, and you don't really look at it any harder. But when I looked at it again, and also I was doing it in a certain way, right? I was sort of reading it in chronological order because I was figuring out what the principle behind curating the book would be. I also wanted to see how her writing, her poetry was changing over the years. And there were so much about my mother that I understood through translating her poetry that I hadn't understood before. I always knew that poetry was important to her. She'd written about it a lot, and she always saw herself as primarily a poet, although she had so many, most of her books are in prose. But I realized that not only was it important to her um, as a way for women to be, as a way for women to be free, and as an instrument for establishing an identity. All of that was true, but it was also important to her as a coping mechanism. And I didn't understand how true that was. Of course, poetry for any poet is a coping mechanism. We know that, of course it is. But I think for her, she had a particularly visceral response to poetry. So much so that she stopped writing poetry for a while, actually, because she felt that her poetry was giving her away, and she was not ready to share all the deepest of her sadness with an audience yet. At the same time, she felt that she could not be honest in her poetry. She felt that there was no room for it. It was a very sacred part of her life, her poetry, and she felt that she could only be at her truest in it. And if her truest self was then giving away the pain that she was going through, she felt the decision she had to make at that time was to actually retract and stop writing poetry. Then she actually kept writing poetry, she just didn't publish it for a while, and then she went back to it. So this relationship that she had with poetry, as she had a compulsion to write poetry, she also had a need for poetry as a way of dealing with her pain. Another thing I also understood, it's interesting that you asked me to read the Dry Leaf. I understood her loneliness and what she felt when she went through separations much more, partly because, I think and through that, I think I got to understand my parents' estrangement better. It had happened when I was really young, but of course we knew what had happened, and we all continued being a close family. My parents were good friends. I'm very close to my brother and sister. So there's all of that warmth, which is very, very true. But of course, buried in it is also a kind of sadness. It's also a kind of mourning, which I understood much better when I was translating her poetry. And finally, I would also say she has a lot of poetry about, she wrote a lot about her relationship with her mother and also her relationship with us. So there's poetry about mothering and there's also poetry about daughtering. And through both of those, I actually got to understand the relationship that she had with my grandmother, which was extremely close, but also complicated. And as a child, I didn't always understand why two women who were so loving, brilliant, adored each other, loved each other's work, were so hugely supportive of each other in every way, could sometimes not get along. And the poetry actually made me understand that, ironically, years after my grandmother was gone, short while after my mother was gone, even though I lived with them all my life and I didn't get it,
Yeah. Well, we are at 7 o'clock. I would love to ask you one quick closing question, and we can invite Katie back on screen whenever she's ready. And my last question for you is, you're an artist, you're a translator, you've worked in films. What excites you at this stage in your creative life, and what is next for you?
So, what excites me about cinema is the same thing that excites me about children's books, which is the fact that these two mediums are so hugely impactful and they're transformative. With kids' books, which is what I mostly write, I've been working with and playing with children for a very long time, for over 30 years. And the fact that you can so clearly see that a book can completely change the way a child looks at her world and looks at the way the choices he or she is going to make in inhabiting that world. And I can't tell you how much, what should I say, how fun, how exciting, how fulfilling, how hope bringing, happy making, and also wisening it is. It's brought me a lot of wisdom, that the time that I've spent with kids and the time I spend writing for kids. So that's what I think. The fact that you can make such a difference to the way, I mean, every book does that. Your book, your brilliant book, makes a huge difference, I'm sure, to the way any reader to the way a reader looks at the world after having read your book. I know that for a fact. A child, what's exciting about that is that you just see what's it's an incredibly it's a fascinating and fun and such a, as I said, happy making, exciting way to let your work leave an imprint in the world around you. So in terms of what's next, so I'm very late. This book I did actually again on the sly. I don't know why all the books for my mother I end up doing on the sly. This I feel she betrayed me on this because she was supposed to do this book with me, but I was supposed to do the second book in a series that I do for Penguin called Mambi, the Marvel series. And the first book, which is called Mambi and the Forest Fire, is a book about embracing your unique identity. It's essentially a book about a monkey who wants to fly like his friend the crow and swim like his friend the turtle, but realizes that because she is brave and she can jump, her gift and her identity is very precious. Anyway, so that book, I've been promising a second one in that series for a long time, and I finally said I will definitely do that in 2020, and I ended up doing Acrobat. Now this book, the first one, was in a way about equality, and I used it to talk about the fact that whether you swim or fly or jump, whether you live in the city or in the village, whether you are Hindu or Muslim or Christian, whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you speak English or Bengali or Hindi, we all have the same rights and we all deserve the same love. That's the way I would talk about equality, use the book to do that. This book, I want it to be about speaking up against wrong. And that I feel very strongly about it. It's a little bit of it's not an easy thing to do for kids, because the last thing a children's book should do is be didactic. You cannot have a preachy children's book. The reason why it worked so well is because there was a thought behind it, but it was fun. It was an adventure. It was basically, so it cannot be a lecturing kind of a book. But I feel very strongly that it's important for children to understand the dangers of intolerance and how that can affect the society that they live in. And I don't feel that I mean, there are different ways of thinking about it, but I feel it is our duty to not shelter our children too much. We have to find safe and child appropriate ways of making children realize that there are choices that you can make as a child that can determine the world that you live in and the democracy that you wish to live in, right? Anyway, so that's the book that I'm late on. And the grown-up book is again a book that I had started working with my mother tentatively called Mother Tongues. And that was going to be a memoir about 3 generations of Bengali women writers, sort of about the development of a multi-generational feminist tradition, if you will.
Oh, beautiful.
That's what it was supposed to be. But now I'm not sure if it should be an intergenerational memoir or if it should be fictionalized somehow. But that's the thinking.
Well, those all sound like incredible projects, and it's such an honor to speak with you, Nandana, about Acrobat, which is just a brilliant, brilliant gathering of poems that will stay with me, that I will keep thinking about. Thank you so much, Katie and Greenlight.
Thank you for making the time, and it's just been so delightful to spend this hour talking with you. Thank you so much. And again, congratulations on all of your wonderful, wonderful achievements.
Thank you.
Thank you both for that lovely discussion. And thanks everybody for joining us. Don't forget to buy your copy of Acrobat in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
Thank you, Katie. Bye.
Bye.